What's going on, guys? Welcome back, and today I'm going to be bringing you my thoughts on the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. You guys told me that you'd like to see this as a video, just me kind of discussing the Falcon and the Winter Soldier and my thoughts on it. I did a poll on Instagram asking whether or not you'd like me to do a video halfway through the season as we are now, or just wait until the end to talk about it, and a majority of you voted for me doing a video for the halfway point of the show, so I'm doing that now. And this will just be kind of an overview of the first 3 episodes. I'm not going to recap them necessarily, but just talk about the aspects that I liked and things that I just like about the show and things that I didn't like about the show. Thankfully, the list of things that I like about the show is far longer than the list of negative things, unlike WandaVision, and I'm just shocked by how much I like this show. I don't want to make it sound like it's like a godsend or it's, you know, the new Citizen Kane, because there are plenty of Marvel movies that I can think of off the top of my head that are better than this, like Iron Man, Guardians of the Galaxy 2, you know, Captain America, the first one, even most of Winter Soldier, even though the climax, I think, of that movie is pretty garbage in retrospect, but this show really impressed me because it feels like a logical continuation of the story of the Captain America movies, as well as, you know, a movie that's so far been adding elements to the lore and to the MCU kind of plot line without creating continuity errors or plot holes or anything like that. It's just a very hard-focused story on what it wants to do, and it doesn't even really feel like a superhero show. In fact, one of the main ideas or themes being explored in it is, you know, the people who are affected by superhero events and how superheroes themselves are affected, or even people that, you know, are considered superheroes or are a part of superhero teams are actually treated in society, and how, you know, they face a lot of the similar issues that real people in the world face. And I really love that because there's no, like, so far there's, you know, they interject kind of into like action scenes into each episode, and I honestly think the action scenes are kind of the weakest part of the episodes. The action scene at the beginning of the first episode, which I think is the strongest episode of the season so far out of the 3 we have, I think the action scene at the beginning is the weakest part, although I had way less problems with it than I did with, well, the entire action in the last episode of WandaVision, which was just horrible CGI. Here, a lot of it feels like it's coordinated stunt work and stuff that has a lot of effort put into it, like the action scene on top of the trucks in the second episode. Although I do feel like the chase scene at the beginning of the first episode is a little bit CGI heavy, it still looks more convincing than anything from WandaVision or even, honestly, like Endgame or Spider-Man or any of those other recent kind of Marvel projects. It looked more convincing, and although I just wasn't really invested in that action scene, I like kind of the little sprinkles of action scenes that were being given. You know, they kind of sprinkle in one main action scene in each episode that feels like it naturally ties into the narrative of the story, and it's also not horribly structured action. So yeah, that's the action in the show is pretty solid. And then, you know, the first episode is really quite solid as well. We get some really interesting exploration into these two characters, Sam and Bucky, kind of on their own and how they're coping following, you know, Steve Rogers, you know, retiring. And you get to see kind of a more personal perspective of their lives, like how Bucky's living his life and how he's basically trying to kind of redeem himself for what he's done in the past. And we've always heard Bucky talk about how he thinks of himself and how he thinks of himself as kind of like a monster, basically, and how he blames himself for all these things he's done wrong. And in the past, we always had Steve Rogers hanging over this character, telling him that, no, it wasn't your fault. But now we're able to kind of see the character on his own without having Steve Rogers there to tell him that it isn't his fault and that he hasn't done anything wrong. And that's kind of a thing with the whole show, is that it feels refreshing to not have Steve Rogers hanging over both of these characters, because in the other movies they were in, they always had Steve Rogers hanging over them, but now it feels like a natural continuation of that, seeing both the characters struggling with their lives without having a character like that looking out for them, and also just together kind of butting heads, because when they were butting heads before, they had Cap to kind of put them in line. Now they're just butting heads on who should be the leader, and they need to kind of come to terms with the fact that they can work together and that they need to work together, because now they have this kind of rival character, John Walker, who is taking up the mantle of Steve Rogers, and they both believe that he is not fit to, in some ways, wield the shield and continue the legacy of Steve Rogers. So it's very interesting, and I really do like that. It's just an interesting dynamic, and there are little bits of like hints here and there that were given of their dynamic in the earlier movies were fun. They had a fun dynamic in the movies that was never able to take center stage, but now we're able to see that dynamic take center stage. And because those characters were kind of secondary protagonists to Steve Rogers, we like already had kind of a connection to them. And now, like, this feels like a natural continuation, and I have previously cared about them. That was a problem with WandaVision, which is that Wanda and Vision were always footnotes in their previous stories. Their relationship was never fleshed out. And in Infinity War, Vision was basically just a plot point, because everyone had to protect Vision, and they had to get Vision from point A to point B, because he has the Infinity Stone in his head, which makes him a target, which basically just renders him to be a plot point to get characters from one place to another, rather than actually being a fully fleshed out character. So when we're expected to care about him, we just don't really care, or at least I didn't. With these characters, we've had time to develop them, like we had Civil War and Winter Soldier, to kind of see bits and pieces of their dynamic, and now seeing them together, trying to work together and do like all this stuff together, it feels natural, and it feels like a natural continuation of those stories, and I really enjoy that. It feels like right. Like, I enjoy this. It doesn't feel like it has to do any extra work, because unlike WandaVision, it doesn't do anything to flesh out Wanda and Vision's relationship or make me care about them. But here, I've already cared about these characters in the past. I felt like they got relegated to extremely minor roles in Infinity War, Endgame, and even in Civil War to some extent. But now we're able to see them more center stage, which I really appreciate about this show, and just see their dynamic and how they're struggling in life. It's really fascinating, and once again, now without having Steve Rogers hanging over Bucky's head the entire time, we're able to see what he's trying to do. And we're also able to see subtlety, which is something I've missed from Marvel. Like, once again, an example I used in my WandaVision video was at the end of Captain America the First Avenger, when Steve arranges the date with Peggy Carter, and then the final line of the film is, "I had a date." That is, some nice little subtlety, and it's a pretty chilling way to end the movie. Here we have some really nice subtlety. We have a flashback scene with Bucky, or as he was called, the Winter Soldier, assassinating a bunch of people, and at first it seems like an unnecessary flashback that's only included for the sake of an action scene. But later on we find out that Bucky is spending time with this old man whose son he actually killed in that scene, and not everyone has picked up on that, because when the man speaks about how his son got killed, and he doesn't know how he got killed, and he doesn't understand why anyone would want to kill his son, we kind of get like the creepy Winter Soldier theme by Henry Jackman kind of creeping into the scene, and Bucky's facial expression changes, and as people continue to reference this plot point, he eventually goes to visit the old man, and you see a shrine in the background in his old man friend's house, and you see a picture of the man that Bucky killed. And I like the subtlety there, because not everyone on YouTube I've seen talk about the show or watch the show, not everyone has picked up on that, and I really appreciate the subtlety of it, that they're approaching it with subtlety, and it's not there are multiple hints given, and it's not like an obvious it's not the best subtlety in the world, but it is something. It's them trying, unlike WandaVision, where we had Wanda literally spelling out to the kids, "You can't reverse death no matter how sad it makes you," which means that I reversed death because it made me sad, and now it's an ironic statement because I'm telling you the opposite of what I did. And it's just a really obvious, metaphor. The entire point of having the dog in that one episode of WandaVision was to spell out her mindset. Here, we are given very subtle hints, and I really appreciated that, because some people may not pick up on that, and it is subtlety, and it's very ground level, character focused stuff, and I really appreciated just seeing some subtlety in Marvel, which is something that I've been missing for a while. And yeah, there are multiple other examples of just a lack of subtlety in Marvel, but I really appreciated the subtlety that was there, and just the nuance. I really appreciated that. being in there. And, there are a lot of interesting themes being explored in this show. From, one scene in the second episode with Sam, we meet this super soldier character, Isaiah, who was experimented on because he was, an African-American man, and they experimented on multiple other African-American or men because they didn't care about them and because whatever they thought they didn't have feelings, as Sam says in the third episode. And then, following that scene, we get this police car pulling up and asking Sam for his ID, and these officers basically antagonizing Sam Wilson because he's black, until the other officer points out to him that it is in fact Sam Wilson, who is a superhero who helped save the world. And he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I just didn't recognize you," which is a really, relevant issue in society, racial profiling, racism, police brutality, stuff like that. It's a very relevant topic, and Marvel usually doesn't bother to do that, but I feel like it is appropriate in, a Captain America, movie, because they are usually the most kind of politically focused, MCU movies and shows and stuff, right? Like the Captain America movies are the most kind of human, and realistic, I suppose, quote unquote realistic elements of the franchise. So I really appreciated seeing Marvel actually addressing a current societal issue, which is that of racial profiling. And there's kind of a theme of that throughout the entire show. Sam's dealing with bank loans. He didn't get paid for being an Avenger. He didn't get loans from Tony Stark. He didn't get, special treatment because he was out there doing the world. He did it because he thought it was right, and he did it because he thought it was the right thing to do. But he doesn't get special treatment. And then here he is getting racially profiled by cops because he's black, and they just didn't recognize the fact that he was one of the people responsible for taking down Thanos. It's a really relevant issue, and I appreciate Marvel touching on that, and they do bring it back in episode 3, so they aren't ignoring it, which is something I was worried about, is that they would bring up interesting themes and then drop them, and I'm still concerned that they may drop these ideas by the end for, another cliche Marvel shooty shoot punch punch lasers finale, but I do really appreciate, the subtlety and the exploration of those themes in the show, and it's just I really appreciated that. Even if it isn't continued throughout the entire thing, I still appreciate Marvel at least attempting some exploration of modern societal issues and some interesting themes, with that of the Falcon still being treated poorly just because he's black, and also not getting special treatment just because he's like he's not getting special treatment. He's not being treated like a special little snowflake just because he was a superhero and he helped save the world. It's the same thing with Sharon Carter. They talk about that in the third episode, how Sharon wasn't a superhero. She didn't have superpowers. She didn't have access to these important assets, to these special people who have all the money in the world and can get themselves out of these situations like Tony Stark did in Civil War. She didn't have access to stuff like that, so here she is out on the run. She had to figure everything out on her own, and Sam touches on that and touches on how Isaiah was treated poorly. It's just a very interesting theme, and I appreciate Marvel attempting to touch on something interesting, and I think they will continue it throughout the show. I'm at least hoping that they will, and that they won't drop it by the end, because I really appreciated that. And there's just a lot of subtlety shown through a lot of the characters in this show. The villains are kind of treated as slightly sympathetic. They are, this is easily the most humanization of the blip we've been given in Spider-Man Far From Home. It was used as humor, which worked in that film, but it still wasn't a deep exploration of the blip. And then in WandaVision, it was briefly touched on and wasn't really brought up again in the fourth episode. And it didn't really play into the narrative. But here, the villains believe that, they were people who weren't disintegrated, and now that everyone is back, they touched on it in Far From Home with these homeless shelters for people who are displaced by the blip, that, they believe that society is not treating those who were here all along fairly. They are going out of their way to create opportunities for people who have come back, but the people who were there who never disappeared are the ones not getting treated properly, and they're going to extreme lengths to prove their point, which is obviously where the kind of villainous aspect comes in, is that they are kind of becoming what they think society is, by, murdering a bunch of innocent people, blowing up a building full of innocent people, simply doing their jobs, for being unaware of the fact that, they are actually hurting more people by, hiding these, resources from the people who need them. They're just doing their jobs and they aren't aware. So they are hurting people. They're hurting innocent people, which is how they feel people are treating them. They feel like they are the innocent people that are getting treated poorly, but then they're going out doing the same thing to other people, which is still an interesting concept and still gives some humanization to, those characters, is that, they feel like they have been wronged, but they're also, wronging other people. They are becoming what they think society is to them. And I really appreciate that, that even they aren't cliche villains. They actually have some motivation behind them, and that even a character like John Walker, the new Captain America, could easily be played up as, kind of a really annoying stoic guy who just kind of walks in and is trying to be Steve Rogers. But you'd get some humanization for that character. You start off the second episode with a scene focused around him and how he doesn't really feel worthy and how he's nervous to be doing this, and he doesn't feel like he's worthy to be taking up the mantle of Steve Rogers. And he says multiple times that he's not trying to be Steve Rogers, but then he does these things that are extremely uncharacteristic for Captain America, like, really brutalizing people, being rather threatening, and just kind of a scary guy. He beats up this one guy and asks him, "Do you know who I am?" And the guy says, "I do know who you are, but I just don't care." And you kind of see an expression on his face where he's, looking rather concerned and he's unsure. He's not a completely villainous character. He's not played off as completely antagonistic, even though some people hate him. And I hear that actor has been getting death threats and he got bullied off of social media, which is just horrible. He's just playing a role in a TV show. I don't know why people are taking that out of context, but I appreciate that character isn't just a, one-dimensional cliche villain, like antagonistic force that Falcon and Bucky have to beat up. He's actually a real person with layers, and it feels like everyone in this show is being treated like that. Even Zemo, we're finding out more about him, but I have a problem with Zemo in this show, which we'll talk about later, but I still appreciate that. And there's just a lot of stuff that I like about the show. I also appreciate the humor in the show. It feels less forced, and it feels like it comes more naturally from the characters' dynamics. Bucky and Sam had kind of a funny dynamic in Civil War that you got to see bits of, and it was rather humorous. Here you get to see more of that, and it doesn't feel like forced Marvel humor. Even the humor in the first episode that comes from the characters, it feels like it naturally comes from them and their dynamics. Like when Bucky goes on a date, and his date asks, "Why do you wear gloves?" And he's like, "I have poor circulation," or something, which is funny to see how that character would react in a situation like that, where he's got a vibranium arm and he has to hide that when he's going on a date. Like it's once again, it's subtle, and it's it's just generally humorous, and it's coming from the characters rather than forced Marvel humor, which I appreciate. And then also all the elements of the show, like so far that they've introduced, like this character Isaiah that they introduced, it's expanding the lore that Bucky met this super soldier character back in the 50s and hid him from other people, didn't tell anyone about him because he'd been through so much that he didn't want to expose him. It's interesting stuff like that. It expands the lore of the Marvel franchise, but also doesn't create continuity errors or anything along those lines. It just expands it, makes it more interesting, which I appreciate, because with something like WandaVision, they, one example being saying that Wanda was a witch all along, but then that also contradicts what they said about Pietro, and it doesn't make sense now how Pietro got powers. Stuff like that just creates continuity errors. This doesn't create continuity errors. It generally makes the plot of the franchise more interesting without, creating continuity errors for the franchise. And I just appreciate that, and it also doesn't shove in unnecessary fan service that doesn't add anything to the story. It's very character-centric and character-focused, and it doesn't, draw its attention away to set up more things. I'm sure it will try and set up more things towards the end, but it doesn't feel like it's adding in a lot of unnecessary fan service. There aren't any unnecessary cameos or like diverging plot lines. It feels like just generally a nice, focused, concise narrative, and it feels like the 6 episodes are kind of the perfect amount of time that you need to tell the story. It's just a nice, concise narrative, and I appreciate that about it. And that's pretty much about it I have to say about the good. I really appreciate the show, and I like a lot of elements to it, but that does not mean that I love everything. I guess firstly, in terms of the bad, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the narrative and the story is rather conventional. You have, a character who's given up something that they feel, a character trying to do the right thing, but by doing that have kind of made way for someone else who is potentially worse to take their place. Rather conventional in some ways. Then you also have, kind of the story of like, okay, we've got to stop these people who, think they are, even though I praised this earlier for being, a nuanced element of the show, it still is rather conventional that, the villains are the people who think they're being wronged but are wronging other people in the process. It's a rather conventional narrative in that respect, but I just appreciate, the character-focused nature of it. It's the dynamics, the character dynamics, and the themes that are being explored that keep me invested. It's not really the plot, so I'll give it a break on that, but yeah, the plot and the narrative is rather conventional. There's nothing super special in that department. Then with Zemo's whole shtick going on, I didn't really love all of the stuff with Zemo. I didn't really love that, it kind of creates potential, or it does create problems for Civil War in terms of, in that movie, what connected the audience to that character was that, he's a human just like us, but he's the only one that's really ever able to tear the Avengers apart. He goes to all these lengths to tear them apart, and it's all because they indirectly caused the death of his family, which means we're able to connect with him because he's just a normal human person living life, and his family got taken away with him like that, and he goes to all these lengths, like, sending a weird device to shut off a power converter so he can just interrogate Bucky to let him go off, and cause a bunch of chaos, stuff like that, just all these elements about him made him rather interesting and connected the audience to him. And now I feel like they've taken that away a little bit by making him, this rich baron. It feels like a rather strange contradiction and tonal shift, considering that, now he's this rich baron who's kind of cracking jokes and we're supposed to kind of laugh at him, but he was kind of a ruthless murderer in Civil War, killing people in bathtubs just to take over their identity. Stuff like that. It's just like, it feels like a rather jarring tonal shift, and I don't really appreciate them turning him into this rich baron because it feels like, it's a contradiction and it takes away what connected to the audience to him in the first place. So there's a lot of elements that I'm not loving about Zemo. I like Daniel Bruhl as an actor, but I do feel like if they continue this, I'm sure he's probably up to something, so that's why he's putting on this facade. He's probably up to something maniacal or he has some malicious intent going on behind the scenes, and he's probably planning something, but so far I'm not loving his role in the show, and I feel like making him a rich baron and retconning that part of his story makes the audience connect with him less, and it makes him less sympathetic. Even though he was a rather evil and villainous character in Civil War, the audience was still able to connect with him. I feel like by turning him into a rich baron, they are taking away that connective tissue for the audience. And, there's still things this show does that are just Marvel conventions that bother me, like the sexualization and objectification of female characters. There's that scene in this show with Sharon Carter, and she's got, like, this really tight outfit that has, like, viewable cleavage, and it just feels really unnatural. It doesn't even make sense for the character, the fact that she's been on the run for like all these years, trying to hide out from all these people trying to hunt her down, and she's been made enemy of the state. And it's like, wouldn't you be wearing some kind of bulletproof vest or like really like protective equipment and not just some weird like sexy outfit? Like, it doesn't feel natural, and it really bothered me. I was hoping they wouldn't sexualize this character, but unfortunately they have done it again, and that's something that I just don't care for in Marvel, and that I really hope they fix. Thankfully it hasn't taken away from the experience too much for me, because I actually really enjoy the show. It bothered me a lot more in WandaVision because I didn't like the show. It isn't taking away as much, and it seems like Sharon won't be playing a huge role in the rest of the story, thankfully. So hopefully there won't be too much more of that, but I did not appreciate the sexualization of that character, and I liked her role in the story, and it naturally tied in, but I did not like the sexualization of that character. I wish they could just treat her like a normal person and not some, model. It bothered me. It still continues to bother me in Marvel. It's something they need to stop doing. And then, a concern, like, lastly, there's some concerns that I have about the show, just some general, like, things that I'm nervous about, like, I feel like the show could go downhill, not as downhill as WandaVision did with its finale, but still, like, I'm worried, like Marvel usually does, they may drop the interesting concepts and themes and instead go for a cliche shooty shoot punch lasers finale. And the things that I'm praising right now, like the villains being two-dimensional or not being one-dimensional, and the John Walker character being treated with nuance rather than being a cliche antagonistic character, I'm worried they may drop that in favor of a shooty shoot punch lasers finale. I'm hoping they won't, but I'm still remaining skeptical because I don't want myself to be disappointed by the finale. And I'm worried that too many elements may be introduced to the point where it becomes convoluted or just overstuffed, like the fact that they're starting to introduce Wakanda at the end of the 3rd episode. That concerns me, like that they may shove in too many elements. That ties in naturally. Like, I liked that element. I like the way they tied it in. It all makes sense, like how Bucky recognized the Wakandan technology. But I'm still concerned that it may overstuff the show. So... yeah, those are my concerns. There are things about Marvel that still bother me. Just the conventions, like the sexualization of women characters, just really annoys me. Still something that I don't like in there. But, just overall, it's a pretty well-structured show. I just like it so far, and I'm hoping that it won't lose me towards the end, although I am concerned it will. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Falcon and the Winter Soldier, the first half of the season. I'm looking forward to the rest of it, and you guys please let me know all your thoughts in the comments below on the Falcon and the Winter Soldier and what you thought of my review as well. And I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.